On a cold morning in 1926, the most watched heiress in America climbed the steps of a city building in Manhattan, walked past the reporters who had followed the romance for months, and married a man her father had forbidden her to see. She was Ellin Mackay, granddaughter of a silver king, daughter of the man whose company owned the cables that ran beneath the ocean, raised in the largest house Stanford White ever built. The man beside her had been born in the Russian Empire and had once sung for coins in the saloons of the Lower East Side. For choosing him, she was cut out of a fortune estimated at $9 million. What no one on those steps could yet see was that within 4 years the money would be gone, and the immigrant her father despised would be the one holding the family up. If you love the stories of the women the Gilded Age tried to keep in their place, take a moment and subscribe. I want you here for this one, because the truth of Ellin Mackay is stranger and sadder than the headlines of her own time ever let on. Chapter 1. The Mother Who Walked Away. Long before Ellin Mackay defied her father, she learned what it looked like when a woman in that family decided she was done. She was a small girl in an enormous house, and the house was Harbour Hill, and the woman was her own mother. Catherine Dewar had been one of the most admired women in New York before Ellin was old enough to understand what admiration in that world required. She came from old stock, the kind of family that measured its standing not in dollars, but in generations, and she had married Clarence Mackay in 1898, and in time presided over a château on the highest ground in Roslyn. She was clever and restless and beautiful, and she did not content herself with the ordinary business of a hostess. She became a leader of the movement for women's suffrage, founding the Equal Franchise Society and serving as its president from 1908. And for a time she stood near the front of one of the great causes of the age, a rich woman lending her name and her drawing rooms to the argument that women should vote. Other wealthy women followed where she led. To the country, she was a figure of energy and conviction. To her daughter, she was, for a few short years, simply there. Then she was not. The gossip began around 1911, and it attached itself to a name, Joseph Blake, a surgeon. In a family so watched, gossip was a kind of weather, and at first it was only weather. But by 1913, the separation had become public, and there was no unseeing it. Catherine Dewar Mackay left her husband, and she left the château, and she left the children. The divorce was finalized in Paris in the early weeks of 1914, and later that same year she married the surgeon in that same city, an ocean away from the house where her daughter was growing up. The law of the time and the settlement between the parents gave Clarence Mackay custody of all 3 children. Their mother had gone, and she had not taken them with her. Weigh what that meant for a girl of about 10. Everything she had been told about her family, its permanence, its grandeur, its sheer solidity, was contradicted by the plain fact of an empty place at the table. The largest private house Stanford White ever designed could hold old master paintings and suits of Renaissance armor and 126 servants, and it could not hold her mother. A child does not reason this through in sentences. A child simply learns, somewhere below language, that the people who are supposed to stay can leave, and that no amount of stone or silver will stop them. It was the first lesson of Ellin Mackay's life, and it shaped every choice she made after it. There is a way of reading her whole future in that single early fact. A girl who learns at 10 that the strongest walls in the world cannot keep a person who wants to leave has learned something her tutors never intended to teach. She has learned that the family's grandeur is not the same as its safety, that the house can be full and the heart of it empty, that in the end, a person's life comes down to the choices she is willing to make and the prices she is willing to pay. Ellin absorbed that lesson early and completely, and it never left her. and when her own moment came to choose between the walls and the wanting, she already knew, in a place deeper than argument, which one she would follow. It is worth remembering how public all of this was, because that is the part a modern reader can underestimate. Catherine Dewar Mackay had not been a private woman whose marriage quietly failed. She had been one of the most visible women in America, photographed and written about, a leader of the suffrage cause whose name drew other wealthy women into the movement behind her. When a woman like that left her husband, it did not happen in the shadows. It happened on the front pages. The gossip had begun years before the break, attaching itself to the surgeon. And by the time the separation came, it was a national entertainment, dissected in every paper that Clarence Mackay's own cables helped carry across the country. The daughter did not have the mercy of a private grief. She grew up knowing that the whole reading public had watched her mother go, and that anyone who looked at her saw, first, the girl whose mother had run off with the doctor. Wealth had not protected the family from that. If anything, the wealth was what made the spectacle worth printing. And so the lesson landed twice, once in the empty place at the table, and once in the newspapers. The house that was supposed to make the Mackays untouchable had instead made their humiliation a public event. All the silver in Nevada could not buy back a single morning of what the papers had said. A child raised in that contradiction learns something her tutors never mean to teach her, that grandeur and safety are not the same thing, that a family can own everything and still be broken in full view of the world. Ellin learned it early, and she never entirely unlearned it, and it is the quiet key to the woman she became. It shaped her father even more visibly. Clarence Mackay had been left, and he had been left in the most public way a man of his position could be, in the newspapers, in the clubs, in the drawing rooms where his wife had once been the brightest presence. He was a proud man to begin with, a devout Catholic of Irish descent who took the forms of respectability seriously, and the desertion hardened something in him. He would not remarry while his first wife lived. He would raise his children himself, in the great house, surrounded by everything money could assemble. And he would decide, with the particular intensity of a man determined never to be humiliated again, exactly who his daughter would become, and whom she would marry. He had lost control of his wife. He would not lose control of Ellin. There is a cruelty in this that the story never quite lets go of, because the father's need to hold on so tightly was born of a real wound. He was not a tyrant for the pleasure of it. He was a man who had watched the one woman he had chosen walk out of his life and into the pages of the press, and who had resolved that it would never happen to him again. The trouble was that he set out to guarantee this by controlling the very person most like the woman who had left, a strong-willed, intelligent daughter with a mind of her own, and, though no one yet knew it, a writer's instinct for saying exactly what she thought. Ellin grew up then, in a house that was half museum and half fortress, raised by a father who loved her and feared what she might do, in the long shadow of a mother who had proven that the walls did not hold. She had governesses and tutors, and every advantage the age could buy. She was groomed for the role a Mackay daughter was expected to fill, a brilliant marriage, a great house of her own, a place among the 400 families who believed they were America's aristocracy. And underneath the grooming, quietly, she was learning to observe, to judge, and to keep her own counsel, the way children do when they have learned early that the adults around them cannot be relied upon to stay. By the time she reached the edge of womanhood, Catherine Dewar had become a distant figure, a name in the papers, a woman living her own complicated life abroad and, in time, back in New York. She would try, near the very end, in 1930, to reconcile with the husband she had left, and she would die that same year before anything could be repaired. But all of that lay far ahead. For the girl in the great house, The mother was simply the proof of a principle, that a woman in this family who wanted a different life had to be willing to lose everything to get it. Ellin had watched her mother pay that price and go. The question the rest of her story answers is what she learned from it, and whether, when her own turn came, she would be willing to pay it too. She would. But first she had to understand exactly how much there was to lose. Chapter 2. The fortress her father built. Before Ellin Mackay could give a fortune away, she had to live inside it, and the fortune was one of the strangest and largest in America. It had come, in the first place, out of the ground. Her grandfather was John William Mackay, and his was the immigrant story the whole country liked to tell itself. He had arrived from Ireland with nothing, drifted west with the miners, and in the 1870s, he and 3 partners struck the big bonanza in the Comstock lode at Virginia City, Nevada, one of the richest single deposits of silver and gold ever found on the continent. Before the mine was exhausted at the end of the century, it gave up more than $100 million in ore, a sum that in the money of a later century would run to something near $4 billion. The men who took it out were called the Bonanza Kings, and John Mackay was the quietest and, in the end, the richest of them. He did not stop at silver. He built cables, laying telegraph lines across the ocean floor to break the monopoly that then controlled the flow of messages between America and Europe, and he founded the companies that would carry his name into the next generation. It is hard now to grasp what that discovery meant. The Comstock lode was one of the richest strikes in the history of mining, and the men who controlled its greatest vein became, almost overnight, among the wealthiest human beings on the planet. They were called the Bonanza Kings, 4 partners who had come up from nothing in the mining camps, and John Mackay, the quietest of the 4, ended as the richest. He was not content to let the silver make him idle. He looked at the way messages crossed the world, at the monopoly that then controlled the telegraph traffic between America and Europe, and charged what it liked for it, and he decided to break it. He laid his own cables across the floor of the Atlantic, founded companies to run them, and forced the price of a transatlantic message down by competing with the men who had owned that traffic outright. It made him a second fortune to stand beside the first, and it turned the family from silver millionaires into something more permanent, the owners of a piece of the world's machinery. That generation was Clarence. He inherited an estimated $45 million and the empire of wire that came with it, and he ran it from New York as chairman of the Postal Telegraph and the Commercial Cable Companies and president of the Mackay Radio and Telegraph Company. In an age before the telephone had conquered distance, the man who owned the cables owned something close to the nervous system of commerce itself. Every stock quotation that crossed the Atlantic, every diplomatic message, every newspaper dispatch from a foreign capital moved through wires that a Mackay company had laid and a Mackay company controlled. It made Clarence rich in the ordinary sense, but it also made him powerful in a way that mere wealth did not, and he built a monument to match. The monument was Harbour Hill. He gave the commission to Stanford White, the most celebrated architect of the American Gilded Age, and told him, in effect, to build the greatest country house on Long Island. White did. Rising on the highest ground in Roslyn, in the district of great estates that lined the North Shore, Harbour Hill was a French Renaissance château modelled on the Château de Maison near Paris, and it was the largest house White ever designed. The numbers still have the power to stop a reader. The building alone cost $781,000 before a stick of furniture was carried in or a single garden planted, and the drive up to it cost a further $150,000. It ran to 80,000 square feet and 52 rooms. It measured 266 feet across. It sat in the middle of 648 acres, and it took 126 liveried servants to keep the house and its grounds. The stone had been hauled from a reservoir on 42nd Street in Manhattan. It was less a home than a statement, and the statement was permanence. Every choice about the house pressed the same claim. It was modelled on a French château of the old aristocracy, so that a family 2 generations out of an Irish mining camp could live inside the borrowed shape of European nobility. It was set on the highest ground for miles, so that it looked down on everything around it. It was built to a scale that no family, however large, could ever fill, because the scale was the message and not a matter of need. A man does not put 52 rooms and 648 acres and 126 servants behind a single family because he requires them. He does it to say a thing that cannot be said in words, that this line has arrived and will not be moving, that the silver and the cables have bought a place in the permanent order of the world. Harbour Hill was an argument in stone, and the argument was that the Mackays were forever. It is one of the quiet lessons of the Gilded Age that the families who built the largest houses were often the ones least sure of their own standing. Old wealth did not need to shout. New wealth, however vast, could never quite stop proving itself, and the proving took the form of stone and acreage and imported art, of houses too large to live in and collections too valuable to enjoy. The very scale of Harbour Hill was a kind of confession, the confession of a family only 2 generations from a mining camp that could not entirely believe it belonged where it now stood. The armour and the acreage were meant to silence that doubt. They never quite did, and the doubt, it turned out, was the truer instinct. Inside, Clarence assembled the proof. He was a serious collector, and he did not collect for show alone. He gathered one of the great private art collections in America, hanging Botticelli and Raphael and Bellini and Antonello da Messina and Duccio on his walls, a Raphael that had once belonged to a queen of Sweden and a duke of the House of Orléans. And in a great hall, he built the most valuable privately owned collection of Renaissance armour in North America, rank upon rank of steel knights standing empty in the half-light, the harnesses of men who had died 4 centuries before. A child raised among them would have grown up believing that her family had always existed and always would, that it belonged in the same sentence as popes and kings, that the silver in the ground and the wire under the sea had bought a place outside of time. That was the illusion the armour was there to create, and it is worth holding on to the illusion, because the whole of Ellin's story is the slow and terrible puncturing of it. Everything about Harbour Hill was designed to say that the Mackays could not fall. The stone said it. The acreage said it. The knights in the hall said it. And within her own lifetime, the paintings would be sold at a loss, the house would be closed and then dynamited. The 648 acres would be cut into 400 ordinary suburban lots, and the fortune that had built it would be gone. The permanence was a performance, and the audience it was meant to convince most of all was the family itself. But in the years of Ellin's girlhood, the performance was flawless, and the father at its centre was a man near the height of his powers. He patronised music and lent his name to good causes, and moved through the season with the gravity of a man who had never doubted his place in it. He had lost his wife, but he had kept the house, kept the children, kept the collection, kept the empire of wire. To the world, he was Clarence Mackay of Harbour Hill, and there were few grander things a man could be. He intended his daughter to inherit that grandeur and to marry it upward, into a name as old and secure as the one his money had purchased. What he could not see, standing in his hall of armour, was that the thing most likely to bring the whole edifice down was not a rival or a market or a war. It was already living under his roof. It was a young woman who had learned, watching her mother, that the walls did not hold, and who was beginning, very quietly, to wonder what she might do with a life if she stopped letting the house decide it for her. Chapter 3. Raised to be traded upward. In a family like the Mackays, a daughter was not exactly a child. She was closer to a treaty, an instrument of alliance waiting to be signed, and Ellin understood this about herself long before she was old enough to resent it. The system that produced her was old and precise, and by the early years of the 20th century it had reached a kind of perfection in New York and Newport. A girl of the great families was raised, educated, and presented, and the presentation, her debut, was the moment she was formally offered to the world as marriageable. Everything before it was preparation, and everything after it was negotiation. She learned languages and music and the management of a large house. She learned to enter a room, to hold a table, to wear clothes that cost more than most Americans earned in a decade. And she learned, above all, that her marriage was not entirely, or even mainly, her own to decide. It was a matter of dynasty. The right match joined two fortunes, or, better still, married new money to an old name and laundered the one into the other. The wrong match was not merely a disappointment. It was a breach of the family's whole reason for arranging her the way it had. Ellin moved through this machinery as its most valuable product. She was a Mackay, heiress to the silver and the cables, mistress-in-waiting of Harbour Hill, and she was watched accordingly. The society columns tracked her, the hostesses appraised her, the eligible young men of the right families were steered toward her, and she toward them. On the surface, she was the perfect debutante, and for a while she performed the part with the competence of a girl who had been trained for nothing else. Underneath, something did not fit, and the thing that did not fit was her mind. Ellin Mackay was genuinely intelligent, and worse, from her father's point of view, she was observant and ironic, with the particular clarity of a person who has learned to watch adults closely because she cannot trust them to behave. She saw the marriage market for what it was. She saw the assemblies and the balls and the careful matchmaking as a machinery of appraisal, and she saw that the thing being appraised was herself. And she had begun, privately, to do the one thing that no part of her training had prepared the family for. She had begun to write. Writing was, for a woman of her position, an unserious and slightly improper ambition, a hobby at best. A Mackay daughter was meant to be written about, in the society pages, not to write herself. But Ellin had the instinct, and she had the eye, and she had the cool, dry, precise voice that would later make her briefly more famous than her father. Words were the one territory in her life that the house did not control. On the page, she was not an heiress, or an asset, or a treaty. She was a mind with opinions, and the opinions were sharp. It is tempting to romanticize this, to imagine the sensitive girl scribbling in secret rebellion. But the truth is quieter and more interesting. Ellin was not, at this stage, a rebel. She was a young woman of her class doing what young women of her class did, going to the parties, wearing the clothes, meeting the approved young men, and simply noticing all the while that the whole arrangement was faintly absurd and that she did not quite believe in it. The noticing was the dangerous part. A daughter who genuinely believed in the system could be trusted to marry within it. A daughter who saw through it, who watched the whole performance with a writer's cool detachment and privately found it faintly ridiculous, was a different and far more volatile thing. She would go along with it right up until the moment she decided not to, and there would be no warning, because the going along had never been belief. It had only ever been manners. Ellin had the manners of her class in perfect order. What she did not have underneath them was the conviction that any of it was sacred, and that missing conviction was the crack through which everything would eventually pour. Her father, watching his composed and dutiful daughter move through the season, mistook the manners for the whole of her. He saw obedience where there was only politeness, and he built his plans for her on that mistake. A daughter who does as she is told but privately withholds her belief is a daughter who, when the right pressure comes, will act. And the pressure was already gathering, though it did not yet have a name. Ellin belonged to a generation that had come of age during and just after the Great War, a generation that had watched the certainties of their parents burn down and had drawn its own conclusions. They were the first children of the modern city, of the automobile and the telephone and the nightclub, and they had far less patience than their parents for the elaborate rituals of the old society. They found the assemblies stiff, the matchmaking crude, the whole apparatus of the 400 families a little ridiculous. Ellin felt all of this, and being a writer, she would eventually do the unforgivable thing. She would say it out loud, in print, where everyone could read it. And there was a hard edge under the whole arrangement that a modern reader has to see plainly, because it explains why the stakes were so total. For a woman of Ellin's class in that era, marriage was not simply a matter of the heart or even of the family's ambition. It was, in a sense, the law still half remembered, a transfer of a person. The older doctrine of coverture, under which a wife's legal identity had been folded almost entirely into her husband's, had shaped the whole world these families lived in. And though the harshest edges of it had been worn down by Ellin's day, its assumptions still governed everything. A daughter's marriage decided whose name she carried, whose household she ran, whose money she lived on, and whose judgment she was expected to accept for the rest of her life. Choosing a husband was the single most consequential act a woman of her position would ever perform, and it was precisely for that reason that her family insisted on making the choice for her. Too much rode on it to leave it to a girl. This is why a wrong marriage was treated not as a private disappointment, but as a catastrophe. A daughter who married badly did not merely embarrass her family. She removed herself and, in a sense, a piece of the family's fortune and future into the keeping of an outsider they had not approved. The entire apparatus of the debut, the chaperonage, the careful steering toward the right young men, existed to prevent exactly that. Ellin understood this machinery from the inside because she had been raised as its most valuable product, and understanding it did not make her grateful. It made her cool. She could see the whole system for what it was, an arrangement designed to spend her wisely, and somewhere in her that clear sight was hardening into a refusal. But that was still to come. For now she was the jewel of Harbour Hill, the daughter her father meant to place, and the young men came and went, and none of them took. She was polite, and she was present, and she gave nothing away. Her father watched her with satisfaction, seeing the perfect heiress he had raised, and did not notice that she was, in the truest sense, ungraspable. A young woman going through the motions of a life she had already, in some private chamber of herself, declined to accept as final. He would notice soon enough. But first, the house had one last great performance to give, the grandest of them all, and it would place Ellin at the very summit of the world she was about to walk away from. Her father was going to give a party for a prince, and for one lit night, the illusion of Mackay permanence would blaze brighter than it ever had before. Chapter 4. A Roof Lit for a King. In the autumn of 1924, Clarence Mackay lit the roof of Harbour Hill in red, white and blue for the heir to the British throne, and for one night the great house became the brightest thing on the north shore of Long Island. The guest of honor was Edward, the Prince of Wales, the young man who would one day, briefly, be king, and who was then touring America as the most photographed bachelor in the world. To receive him at Harbour Hill was the summit of a certain kind of American ambition, the moment when new money laid its table for the oldest name in the English-speaking world and found itself equal to the occasion. Clarence Mackay spared nothing. He invited some 1,200 guests, the whole of the society he had spent his life climbing into, and he dressed his house to meet a prince. The maples along the Great Drive were strung with small blue lights, so that the approach to the house ran for the better part of a mile through a tunnel of soft blue fire. And on the roof of the château, he set rows of bulbs in red and white and blue, arranged in the shape of the American flag, and lit them, and the flag on the roof of Harbour Hill could be seen across the water from Roslyn Harbour. It is hard, at a distance of a century, to recover how enormous this was. This was not a wealthy man giving a good party. This was the ruler of an empire of wire presenting his house, his fortune, his collection, and his family to the future King of England, and doing it on a scale that the newspapers of 2 continents would describe for weeks. Every element of it was a message, and the message was the one the armour in the hall had always been meant to send. The Mackays belonged. They belonged with princes. Whatever John Mackay had been when he came out of Ireland with nothing, his grandson now lit his roof for royalty, and the royalty came. Understand what a party like this actually was, because it was not entertainment in any ordinary sense. It was a demonstration of arrival, staged for the most important possible witness. America had no aristocracy of blood, and the families who had made great fortunes in the generation before spent the next one trying to buy their way into the appearance of one, marrying titles, building châteaux, collecting the art of dead kings, to host the heir to the British throne, the living embodiment of the oldest royal line in the Western world, and to host him on a scale that impressed even him, was to announce that the distance between a silver miner's grandson and a king had closed. Every blue light along the drive, every bulb in the flag on the roof, every one of the 1,200 guests, was part of a single sentence, and the sentence was that the Mackays had made it all the way to the top. There was no higher rung. Clarence had climbed the whole ladder his father started, and on that autumn night he stood on the last step of it with a prince in his ballroom. For a man who had been publicly humiliated by his wife's desertion a decade before, the night must have carried a private vindication as well. The world that had watched Catherine Dewar walk out of his house now watched a future king walk into it. Whatever had been broken in the newspapers was answered that night in blue fire visible across the water. He had kept the house, kept the children, kept the fortune, and now he had crowned it all by receiving royalty in the greatest of the Long Island palaces. If there was a single evening in Clarence Mackay's life when he could believe that grandeur and safety were finally the same thing, that the family was as permanent as the stone it was built from, this was that evening, and moving through the blue light and the crowd of 1,200, dancing under the flag on the roof, was Ellin Mackay, 21 years old, the daughter the whole performance was in some sense arranged around. She was the heiress of Harbour Hill, presented that season and every season to exactly the kind of company her father had assembled, a prince at the centre of it, the eligible aristocracy of 2 countries around her. If the marriage market had a single perfect stage, this was it, and she stood at the middle of it, precisely where her father had always meant her to stand. And here is the detail that gives the night its terrible edge in hindsight. This same season, the season of the prince and the flag on the roof, was the season Ellin Mackay met Irving Berlin. While her father was arranging the grandest demonstration of the family's arrival that money could buy, presenting his daughter to the heir of the British throne. The daughter was quietly beginning the acquaintance that would take her out of that whole world for good. The two things were happening at once, the peak and the turn, the summit and the first step down from it, and no one at the ball could have told the difference. To every guest in that shining crowd, Ellin Mackay was exactly what she appeared to be, the heiress of Harbour Hill at the centre of her father's triumph. Only she knew, if even she yet knew it, that the world being celebrated around her had already begun to lose its hold on her. Within a year and a half, she would trade all of it, the house and the fortune and the place among princes, for a 10-minute civil ceremony and a Lower East Side songwriter. The roof would never blaze like that again. The night the Mackays reached the top was the night their daughter started to leave. This is the image to hold, because everything that follows breaks against it. The lit house, the flag on the roof visible across the harbour, the prince in the ballroom, and the 1,200 guests, and the tunnel of blue fire, and the beautiful, watchful daughter moving through it all as the living proof that the Mackays had arrived. It was the most complete expression of the family's grandeur that would ever exist, and it stands at the exact hinge of the story, because in that same season, at some other and far humbler gathering, Ellin Mackay met a man who wrote songs for a living, and the light on the roof of Harbour Hill began, though no one could have known it, to go out. The two images belong together, and the whole of the story lives in the space between them. Here is the lit house, the flag of bulbs on the roof, the mile of blue fire, the prince in the ballroom, the 1,200 guests, the daughter dancing at the summit of her father's world. And there, entering the same season quietly and unremarked, is the man who will take her out of it, a songwriter from the tenements whose name means nothing to anyone in that shining crowd. The grandest night the family ever staged and the beginning of its unmaking are the same night. That is the kind of hinge history rarely offers so cleanly, the peak and the turn folded into a single evening, and it is worth holding both halves of it in mind, because everything the lit roof promised, the permanence, the arrival, the safety of the great name, was already, on that very night, beginning to come apart in the person of a 21-year-old girl who had met a man her father would rather have died than accept. Her father, glowing with the success of the greatest party of his life, could not have imagined it. He had shown his daughter to a prince. He had every reason to expect that she would marry into the world he had lit the roof for. What he had actually done, without knowing it, was to give her one last, dazzling look at the summit of the thing she was about to refuse. The house had never shone so brightly. It would never shine so brightly again. And the man who would take her out of it had been born in a wooden house in the Russian Empire, in a world about as far from the flag on the roof of Harbour Hill as it was possible for a human life to begin. Chapter 5. The immigrant they called Nobody. The man, Clarence Mackay, considered beneath his daughter, had arrived in America as a small child with nothing at all, and by the time he met Ellin, he was one of the richest and most famous songwriters alive. This is the fact the whole story turns on, and it is the fact most often told wrong. He had been born Israel Isidor Berlin in the Russian Empire in 1888, in a Jewish family in a corner of a world that did not want them. The exact town is uncertain in the records, but the reason the family left is not. They fled the pogroms, the organized violence against Jews that swept the empire in those years, and like millions of others, they turned toward America. They came through Ellis Island in September of 1893, when the boy who would become Irving Berlin was 5 years old, and they settled, as the poorest of the newcomers did, on the Lower East Side of New York, in the crowded tenements where a dozen languages shared a single street. It was a childhood of real poverty. His father, who had been a cantor in the old country, died when the boy was 13, and Israel went to work to help feed the family. He had been working in one way or another since he was 8. He sang for coins. In time, he became a singing waiter in the saloons and cafes of the immigrant districts, learning the trade of the popular song from the inside, at the bottom, where the audience was drunk and the tips were small, and a boy either learned to hold a room or went hungry. He published his first song in 1907 and was paid 33 cents for the rights to it. That is the true flaw of the story. A penniless immigrant boy singing for tips and selling a song for the price of a sandwich. And then, with a speed that still astonishes, he rose. In 1911, he wrote a song called Alexander's Ragtime Band, and it went around the world, and it made him famous before he was 30. He had a gift that did not depend on training he had never received, an ear for the plain American phrase, and the melody that lodged in the memory and would not leave, and the country could not get enough of it. He began to write hit after hit. He founded his own music publishing company, so that he owned the songs he wrote and the income they earned. And in 1921, he did something no songwriter had ever done. Together with the producer Sam Heiress and the film man Joseph Schenck, he built his own Broadway theatre, the Music Box, on West 45th Street, the only theatre in the history of Broadway put up specifically to house the work of a single songwriter. The land and the building together came to more than $1 million. He filled it with his own reviews, year after year, and the public came. The theatre on West 45th Street was the clearest proof of what he had become. He filled it, year after year, through the early 1920s, with lavish reviews of his own songs, glittering productions that drew the fashionable crowds of the city to hear the newest work of the most celebrated songwriter in the country. To have a Broadway house built around his name, to fill it with his own music and watch the public line up for it season after season, was a level of success almost no composer of popular song had ever reached. This was the man in the years he was courting Ellin Mackay. Not a hopeful young talent, but an established titan of American entertainment, a fixture of Broadway, a household name whose melodies were sung in every corner of the country. The distance between the reality of Irving Berlin in the middle 1920s and the image of the poor, struggling musician could hardly be greater. And the whole story is misread the moment that distance is forgotten. So the picture of Irving Berlin as a struggling musician, a poor, unknown scraping by, is simply false, and the story insults itself when it repeats it. By 1924, the boy from the Lower East Side was a man of real wealth and towering fame, a Broadway impresario who owned his own theatre and his own publishing house, and a catalogue of songs the whole country was singing. The composer Jerome Kern, asked once to place Berlin in the history of American music, refused the premise of the question. Irving Berlin, he said, has no place in American music. He is American music. That was the man Clarence Mackay called a nobody. The wealth was not a rumour or a matter of a lucky season. It was built, and it kept building, and it built on foundations he owned outright. He wrote and he wrote, hundreds of songs, and then 1,000, and in the end an estimated 1,500 of them, and a great many of them became the songs the country sang without thinking, the melodies that seemed to have always existed. In the very years he was courting Ellin, he was turning out standards that would outlive almost everyone who first heard them. He wrote Blue Skies. He wrote, a little later, Putin on the Ritz. Years before, during the Great War, he had written a song he set aside as too solemn to use, and he would pull it out of a drawer in 1938 and give the country God Bless America. And still ahead of him, unimaginable, on the night Clarence Mackay was lighting his roof for a prince, lay White Christmas, the song that would become the best-selling record the world had ever produced. This was the scale of the man. He was not a promising young talent hoping to marry up. He was one of the defining artists of the American century, at the height of his powers, and he was pouring those powers, in the season of the courtship, into songs meant for one particular young woman to hear. And he owned his work, which in that trade was almost unheard of, and which is the surest sign of how shrewd he was beneath the charm. He had built his own publishing company, so that the copyrights to his songs and the money they earned belonged to him, and not to some firm that had bought them cheap. Every time one of his melodies was sold as sheet music, or played on the radio, or sung on a stage, the income ran back to him. He was, in the language of a later age, a man who owned the means of his own success, a former singing waiter who had made certain that no one would ever again pay him 33 cents for a song. When such a man decided to make a young woman independent by handing her the rights to one of his ballads, it was a gift of real and lasting substance, and it is the hinge on which the second half of this story turns. There was one shadow across the wealth and the fame, and it matters, because it made Berlin a man who understood loss. In February of 1912, he had married a young woman named Dorothy Goetz, and he had taken her to Havana for their honeymoon. She contracted typhoid fever there, and she died within months, in the summer of 1912, 20 years old. Berlin, shattered, wrote his first true ballad out of the grief, a song called When I Lost You, and it became one of the great popular successes of its day. He had learned, young, that everything could be taken in an instant, that the brightest happiness could turn overnight into a grave. He was a widower of long standing by the time he met Ellin Mackay, a man about 15 years older than she was, carrying a sorrow she could not yet imagine, and he would carry a second, far worse one, before her father ever spoke to them again. If the objection to him had been that he was poor, it would have collapsed on contact with the facts, because he was not poor. The objection was something else, and it was uglier and more honest, and it is the subject of everything that comes next. What Clarence Mackay saw when he looked at Irving Berlin was not a bank balance. It was a Russian-born Jewish immigrant from the tenements of the Lower East Side, a man of the theatre, a widower, a person from precisely the world that the flag on the roof of Harbour Hill had been lit to hold at a distance. The money made no difference to that. If anything, the money made it worse, because it meant the man could not simply be dismissed. Chapter 6. The suitor her father forbade. When Ellin Mackay fell in love with Irving Berlin, her father did not see a famous man. He saw everything his family had spent 3 generations trying to outrun, standing in his own drawing room, asking for his daughter. They had met, as far as the record allows, in 1924, at a dinner party, in the ordinary way that people meet, and the attraction seems to have been quick and real. She was a clever, watchful heiress with a writer's mind. He was the most successful songwriter in America, a self-made man of enormous charm who had built everything he had out of nothing. To Ellin, raised among men who had inherited their importance, a man who had made his own must have been a revelation. To Berlin, moving for years among the famous and the rich, this particular young woman was something rarer still, serious, ironic, and entirely herself. Whatever the machinery of the marriage market had intended for Ellin Mackay, it had not intended this. Her father's reaction was total. His objection was not personal in the small sense. He did not know Berlin as a man and had no private grievance against him. The objection was categorical, and it rested on three things that Clarence Mackay regarded as disqualifying beyond appeal. Berlin was a Jew, and the Mackays were devout Catholics who took their faith and its social boundaries with complete seriousness. Berlin was a man of show business, a Broadway figure from the world of theatres and nightclubs, which the old society regarded as scarcely respectable, however much money it generated. And Berlin was a widower, some 15 years older than Ellin, a man with a past, where her father wanted a young husband with an unmarked name. Wealth did not answer any of these objections. A rich Jewish songwriter from the Lower East Side was, to Clarence Mackay, precisely as impossible as a poor one, and possibly more dangerous, because he could not be waved away as a fortune hunter. The force of this belongs to its decade, because the 1920s in America were not a tolerant time, and in some ways the intolerance was hardening. The lines of caste and creed that divided the country were rigid and public, and, in that particular decade, hardening. This was the era of a resurgent Ku Klux Klan that marched not only against Black Americans, but against Catholics and Jews and immigrants of every kind. An era of quotas and exclusions and a widespread, respectable anti-Semitism that ran straight through the drawing rooms of the very society the Mackays belonged to. For a Catholic dynasty to forbid a marriage to a Jew was not, in that world, regarded as bigotry. It was regarded as common sense. Clarence Mackay was not an unusual man for holding the view he held. He was an entirely typical one, and that is what made the wall in front of Ellin so high. She was not fighting one stubborn man. She was fighting the settled conviction of an entire class, the shared and respectable prejudice of the world that had raised her, a prejudice so ordinary that most of the people who held it would have been puzzled to hear it called prejudice at all. To them, it was simply how things were done. Catholics married Catholics. The old families married the old families, or the new fortunes that had been properly laundered by a generation of the right schools and the right marriages. Jews, however rich, however gifted, however American, married among themselves, and a daughter of the Mackays no more married a Lower East Side songwriter than she flew to the moon. This was the air Ellin had breathed her whole life, and to defy it was to defy not just her father, but the unanimous judgment of everyone she had ever known, the hostesses and the cousins and the friends of her girlhood, the whole warm crowd that had danced under the flag on the roof. To marry Berlin was to walk out of all of it at once, to become, in the eyes of that world, a woman who had thrown herself away. It is easy to say the words, gave up a fortune, defied her father, married for love, and to let them slide past as the familiar furniture of a romance. It is harder and truer to sit with what such a choice actually demanded of a woman in her position. She was not risking a little discomfort. She was accepting exile from the only world she had ever known, the loss of her father, the loss of her home, the loss of $9 million, and the loss of her standing among every person she had grown up beside, all at once, permanently, in full public view, with the whole country watching to see whether she would flinch. Most people, offered that price, discover that their love is more negotiable than they had thought. Ellin did not flinch, and she did not negotiate, and she did not look for a compromise that would let her keep the man and the money and the father too. She understood that no such compromise existed, that the choice was total, and she made it cleanly. That kind of clarity is rarer than courage, and she had both. There was a deeper current under the father's refusal, and it ran back to the wound at the very start of the story. Clarence Mackay had already lost the one woman he had chosen for himself, publicly, to a man he had not chosen. and the loss had hardened into a determination to control what could still be controlled. His daughter was the thing that could still be controlled, or so he believed. To watch her now choose her own man against his wishes, in defiance of everything he stood for, was to watch the old catastrophe begin again, the woman of the family slipping out of his grasp toward a man from outside the walls. It touched the rawest nerve he had. A calmer man, a man who had not been left, might have found some accommodation, might have bent enough to keep his daughter close. Clarence could not bend, because bending was the thing his whole life since the divorce had been organized against. He had been made a fool of once in the papers. He would not permit it a second time, not by his own child. And the objection was not only about faith, though faith was the loudest part of it. Berlin was also a widower with a past, and a man 15 years older than Ellin, where a father dreamed of a young husband with an unmarked history. Berlin was a man of the theatre, the nightclub, the popular stage. A world the old society regarded as glamorous to visit and impossible to marry into. Each of these, on its own, would have troubled a father of Clarence Mackay's stamp. Together, in one man, they amounted to a total impossibility. That the man was also rich and famous did not soften the objection. It sharpened it, because a poor unknown could have been bought off or waited out, while a wealthy celebrity who genuinely loved her and whom she genuinely loved could be fought only head-on. So head-on Clarence went, with everything he had, and the first weapon he reached for was distance. The gap between the two worlds was almost too neat to be true. On one side stood Harbour Hill, the flag lit on the roof for the Prince of Wales, the Hall of Armour, the 400 families who believed themselves America's aristocracy. On the other stood the memory of a wooden house in the Russian Empire, a ship to Ellis Island, a boy singing for coins in a Lower East Side saloon. Clarence Mackay had lit his roof to say that his family had crossed from the second world to the first and would never go back. Now his own daughter proposed to marry the second world in the person of the man who had climbed out of it, and to do so in the full glare of the newspapers that had described the prince's ball. It was, from the father's point of view, far worse than a bad match. It was the public undoing of everything the lit roof had declared. So he did what a man of his position and his temper did. He forbade it, absolutely, and without room for negotiation. And when forbidding it did not end the matter, he reached for the oldest instrument a rich father has. He decided to put an ocean between his daughter and the man she wanted, and to use the months and the distance to bring her to her senses. He would send Ellin to Europe. It was the conventional move, the move that had ended 100 unsuitable romances among families like his. He had every reason to believe it would work. He had not reckoned with two things. He had not reckoned with his daughter, who had learned as a child exactly how much a determined person in this family was willing to lose, and he had not reckoned with the fact that the man he was trying to shut out made his living, and his fame, by sending words and music through the air, straight into the ear of a listening public, across any distance at all. Chapter 7. The Essay That Shook Society. Before she married him, Ellin Mackay did something no debutante of her rank was supposed to do. She told the whole country, in print, exactly what she thought of the world that had raised her. The magazine she chose was barely alive. The New Yorker had been founded only that spring, in 1925, and by the autumn it was struggling, thin and underfunded, and uncertain of its audience. The kind of venture that folds quietly within a year and is forgotten. Its editor was Harold Ross, and Ross was casting about for anything that might give the magazine a reason to exist. Into this came a short essay by a young woman almost no reader had heard of as a writer, though every reader of the society pages knew her name. It was called Why We Go to Cabarets, and it was signed, with perfect coolness, by a post-debutante, which is to say, by exactly the kind of girl the old society was built to protect and display. The piece was a small masterpiece of controlled contempt. In it, Ellin explained, on behalf of her whole generation, why the young people of her class had abandoned the old assemblies and private dances for the nightclubs and cabarets of the modern city. Her elders were scandalized by the cabarets. Ellin turned the scandal on its head and argued that the cabaret was, if anything, the more civilized choice. At last, she wrote, tired of fruitless struggles to remember half-familiar faces, tired of vainly trying to avoid unwelcome dances, tired of crowds, we go to a cabaret. It was not decadence that drove them out of the ballrooms, she explained, but a kind of fastidiousness. We go to cabarets, she wrote, because of the very fastidiousness that our elders find so admirable a quality. We have privacy in a cabaret. In the old assemblies, a girl was thrown among people chosen for her by others and obliged to be pleasant to all of them. In a cabaret, she chose her own table. We do not have to listen, she wrote. We are with people whose conversation we find amusing. Read a century later, it seems mild enough, but in 1925 it landed like a stone through a window. Here was a daughter of one of the first families of America, an heiress raised inside the very system she was describing, calmly informing her parents' entire world that their most cherished rituals were tedious and that her generation had quietly walked away from them. The New York Times put it on the front page. Newspapers across the country reprinted it and argued about it, and the little dying magazine that had published it caught fire. The New Yorker had been selling around 3,000 copies. By the end of the year, it was selling something near 10 times that. The essay is widely credited as the piece that saved the magazine, the first newsstand hit of a publication that would go on to become one of the most admired in the language. The scale of that is easy to underestimate. A magazine that had been weeks from folding was rescued, and the shape of American letters for the next century was quietly altered by a short essay from a society girl explaining why she preferred nightclubs to debutante balls. The New Yorker would go on to publish some of the finest writers of the age, to define a certain kind of American wit and intelligence, to become an institution. And the moment it turned from a failing experiment into a going concern can be traced to Ellin Mackay's byline. She did not merely write a popular piece. She threw the magazine a lifeline at the exact instant it needed one, and the magazine never forgot it. That a 22-year-old with no publishing history could do that, on her first real attempt, reveals the mind her father was trying to marry off to a suitable young man. And it should be said plainly that the essay was not a lucky accident, not a single clever piece from a girl who happened to catch a mood. It was the first public appearance of a real writer, a person with a genuine and unusual command of the language and the nerve to use it against her own world. Everything that came later, the 4 novels, the decades of stories, the long working life at the desk, was already visible in that one piece, in the poise of it, the control, the refusal to raise her voice while saying something that would make her father wince. She had a gift, and she had the temperament to go with it, and the combination was exactly the thing her upbringing had no place for. A gifted daughter was an inconvenience, because a gift wants to be used, and using it meant stepping out of the frame the family had built for her. The essay was the first step out of that frame, taken in front of the entire country. And once she had taken it, there was no stepping back in. It was not the mind of an ornament. It was the mind of a writer good enough to save a magazine by accident, on her way to doing something far more dangerous with the same clear voice. There is a story, often told, that Ross had nearly not run it, that he had left the piece sitting at the bottom of a pile, and that it was his wife and partner, Jane Grant, who pushed him to publish, predicting that it would make wonderful publicity. She was right beyond anything she could have guessed. Ross, in gratitude, is said to have given the young author a lifetime subscription to the magazine she had rescued. What made the piece so electric was not scandal in the ordinary sense. There was nothing improper in it, no confession, no named names. What shocked people was the source. It was one thing for an outsider to mock the rituals of high society. It was another thing entirely for one of its own daughters, a Mackay, raised at the very centre of it, to turn around and describe her parents' whole world as a tedious machine she and her friends had quietly abandoned. It was a defection announced from inside the walls, and it was written with a poise that made it impossible to dismiss as the tantrum of a spoiled girl. She was not raging. She was explaining, coolly, why an entire generation of the elite had stopped believing in the forms its elders held sacred, and the calm was what made it devastating. And she had signed it. She had not hidden behind an initial or a pseudonym that fooled no one and protected everyone. She had put her opinions into the world under a description that pointed straight at her, a post-debutante, and let the reading public draw the obvious conclusion. In doing so, she claimed something that girls of her class were never supposed to claim: the right to a public voice and a public argument, the right to be the author of a statement rather than merely the subject of a society column. For a young woman whose entire upbringing had trained her to be looked at, to be appraised, to be written about, the act of writing, of being the one who set the terms, was a small revolution in itself. She had discovered that on the page she could not be married off, or managed, or sent abroad. On the page, she was simply right or wrong, and she was, most readers had to admit, rather brilliantly right. The importance of this to the larger story is easy to miss and impossible to overstate. At the exact moment her romance with Irving Berlin was becoming a public scandal, Ellin Mackay was not merely a rich man's daughter waiting to be given away. She was a writer with a national reputation of her own, a young woman who had proven she could command the attention of the whole country with nothing but her own words and her own opinions. She had a voice, and the voice was entirely hers, owned by no father and no fortune. And she had used it, in the most public way imaginable, to declare that she was finished with the world of the assemblies and the arranged evenings, the world of the flag lit on the roof for a visiting prince. She had said it in print, wittily and coolly, for the whole country to read. Within weeks, she would say it again, far more plainly, and this time there would be no wit in it and no taking it back. She would say it by walking into a public building on a January morning and marrying the man her father had forbidden. The essay was the rehearsal. The wedding was the performance. And between the two lay one last attempt by her father to stop her, an attempt that carried her across an ocean and failed for the most modern of reasons. Chapter 8. An ocean sent to divide them. Clarence Mackay's answer to the romance was to put an ocean between the lovers, and it was the worst move he could have made. He was fighting a modern war with the weapons of an older one. The plan was conventional, and, by the logic of his class, sound. A daughter infatuated with an unsuitable man was sent abroad, to Europe, for an extended tour among the right people and the right places, and in the months of absence, the infatuation was expected to cool while a more suitable prospect was found. Distance had ended 100 such romances in families like the Mackays. The ocean did the work. A young woman surrounded by eligible aristocrats in London and Paris, far from the disreputable songwriter, would surely, in time, come to her senses. So Ellin was sent away, and her father settled in to wait for the cure to take. It did not take, and the reason it did not take is the neat, almost poetic center of the whole story. The man Clarence Mackay was trying to shut out was the single person in America least troubled by distance, because sending sound across great spaces was precisely his trade. Irving Berlin did not need to reach Ellin in person. He was one of the most famous songwriters in the world at the dawn of the age of radio, and he could reach her the way he reached everyone, through the air. He wrote songs, and the songs were broadcast and published and sung on both sides of the Atlantic, and some of the most tender ballads of his career were written in these months with an audience of one truly in mind. He wrote Remember. He wrote All Alone. And in this period he wrote the song that would become their private anthem and, in time, her security, a song called Always, with its promise of a love that would last not for an hour or a day, but always. To feel the full absurdity of the situation, hold the two pictures side by side. On one side is the entire machinery of one of the great American fortunes, mobilized to move a single young woman as far from a man as the map allowed, the first-class passage, the European hotels, the letters of introduction to the right households, the chaperones, the whole apparatus of wealth arranged around the single purpose of keeping two people apart. On the other side is one man at a piano in New York with a melody and a microphone and the new invention of broadcast radio, and the man simply plays, and the sound travels farther and faster and more intimately than any ship could carry a passenger, straight over the ocean and into the ear of the very woman all that money was trying to isolate. The fortune moved her body. The songs reached her heart, and they did it for the price of a broadcast. It was, in its way, a perfect collision between the old world and the new. Clarence Mackay's power was the power of accumulated wealth, of ships and houses, and the ability to physically arrange the world to his liking. Irving Berlin's power was the power of the coming century, of mass media, of a voice that could be everywhere at once and belonged to everyone, and could not be shut in a room or sent abroad or bought off. The father was trying to win a modern contest with the tools of an older one, and he could not see that the ground had shifted under him. The songs on the radio were not merely a courtship. They were a demonstration that the world Clarence Mackay ruled was already being replaced by a world Irving Berlin helped to build. A world in which distance meant nothing, and a poor boy's melody could outrun a rich man's fleet. There is something almost unbearable in the picture of it. A father spends a fortune to carry his daughter to the far side of an ocean, and the man he is trying to defeat simply sits down at a piano and sends his answer over the water into every drawing room and every dance hall, where she cannot help but hear it. The whole apparatus of Mackay wealth, the ships and the hotels and the careful chaperonage, was arrayed against a man with a melody, and the melody went straight through it. The newspapers, which had been following the romance since before she left, kept the story alive across the separation, reporting and denying engagements, tracking the songs, turning the private courtship of an heiress and a songwriter into a serial the whole country followed from week to week. The more her father tried to hide her, the more famous the romance became. This was the trap he had walked into without seeing it. Every step he took to end the affair became, in the hands of the press, another chapter of it. The trip abroad was reported as a father's desperate move. The songs were reported as the lover's answer. Denials of an engagement were printed one week and contradicted the next, and each denial and each contradiction sold papers and deepened the public's investment in the outcome. The country had taken sides. To millions of readers who would never set foot in Harbour Hill, the heiress and the songwriter had become a kind of national romance, a story about whether love could beat money and pedigree, and the whole reading public was waiting to see how it came out. A private family quarrel had become a public serial with an audience of millions, and the more Clarence Mackay struggled against it, the larger the audience grew. For Ellin, on the far side of the water, the songs must have arrived like letters no chaperone could intercept. A father could control where she went and whom she was introduced to, and which invitations she received. But he could not keep a melody off the air, and he could not stop a song from meaning what both of them knew it meant. When a new Berlin ballad about longing and constancy crossed the ocean and filled the drawing rooms of the very people her father had sent her among. It was a private message hidden in plain sound, sung by strangers who had no idea they were carrying it. She heard the man's voice in his music, while an ocean and her father's whole fortune stood between them, and the effect was the opposite of forgetting. Absence, which was supposed to weaken the attachment, deepened it into something like certainty. Away from Harbour Hill and the pressure of the house, with only the songs for company, she had the distance to see her own life clearly. And what she saw was that she wanted this man and this life, and was prepared to pay for it. And Berlin, for his part, did not waver either. A lesser man, faced with the wall of a great fortune and a determined father and the practical impossibility of it all, might have let the romance cool during the long separation, might have decided a peaceful life was worth more than a fight he could easily lose. Berlin was not a lesser man, and he had a will as hard as the Mackays beneath the charm. He had built everything he had out of nothing, against longer odds than this, and he was not about to be defeated by an ocean and a disapproving father. So he did the one thing he knew how to do better than anyone alive. He wrote. He turned his longing into songs and sent them out into the world, and the songs did his arguing for him, patiently, tenderly, month after month, until the woman on the far side of the water had heard, in melody after melody, exactly how completely she was loved. Two people that certain, that stubborn, that unwilling to let a fortune decide the matter, were never going to be talked out of each other. The separation only proved it. And Ellin, on the far side of the ocean, made her decision. Whatever her father had hoped the distance would do, it did the opposite. It clarified things. Away from Harbour Hill, away from the machinery of appraisal and expectation, with the man's songs following her across Europe and the man himself waiting at home, she understood exactly what she wanted and exactly what it would cost. She had watched her mother pay everything for a different life and go. She had written to the entire country that she was finished with the world of the assemblies. Now she would prove it. She came home from the ocean her father had sent her across, and she came home decided. Her father had gambled on distance, and distance had lost. He had one card left, the largest and cruelest one, the fortune itself, and he would play it. But by the time he played it, the thing was already done, because his daughter had stopped being a girl who could be managed and had become a woman who had made up her mind. All that remained was for her to walk into a public building on a cold morning and put her decision beyond the reach of anyone, including him. Chapter 9. 10 Minutes at City Hall. On the 4th of January 1926, the wedding of the decade took about 10 minutes, cost the bride a fortune, and was over almost before the reporters outside understood what had happened. There was no cathedral. There was no reception under a lit roof, no 1,200 guests, no tunnel of blue light along a mile of drive. There was a civil ceremony in a municipal building in Lower Manhattan, the plain public machinery by which any two citizens of the city were married, the same rooms and the same clerks that served the shop girl and the office clerk and the immigrant off the boat. The heiress of Harbour Hill, granddaughter of a silver king, daughter of the man who owned the cables under the ocean, was married the way the ordinary people of the city were married. Quickly, plainly, and in public, with the winter light coming through municipal windows. Picture the ordinariness of it, because the ordinariness was chosen and it was the point. A cold morning in the first week of January, a public building full of the day's routine business, licenses and forms and clerks working through a line of citizens. And into that plain civic machinery came the most watched young woman in America, to be married with no more ceremony than the law required of anyone. There were no cardinals, no cathedral, no orchestra, no guests in the hundreds. None of the grandeur that a Mackay wedding was expected to command, and that her father could have provided 100 times over. There was a form, and a clerk, and a few words, and 2 signatures, and it was finished. A wedding that the whole country would read about had been conducted with less pomp than a shopkeeper's. That plainness was not an accident of haste. It was a statement as deliberate as anything her father had ever staged, and it said the opposite of what his parties said. Where the lit roof and the 1,200 guests had declared that the Mackays belonged among princes, this bare civil ceremony declared that Ellin was done with all of that she would be married as a citizen among citizens, in the same rooms that served the immigrant and the working girl, to a man who had come up through exactly that world. Every absence at the wedding, the missing cathedral, the missing guests, the missing father, was itself a message. She was not marrying into the old world. She was walking out of it, in front of everyone, and choosing the plain modern city and the plain modern ceremony as the setting for the most important act of her life. 10 minutes in a public building, and it was done. The contrast was the whole meaning of the act, and Ellin surely knew it. She had been raised for a wedding that would have been counted among the social events of the age, a great ceremony joining the Mackay fortune to some equally ancient name, the culmination of everything the debutante machine had prepared her for. She chose instead the briefest and least grand ceremony available to an American, precisely because it was brief and least grand, because it belonged to the modern city and to the man beside her, and to no part of the world her father had lit his roof for. 10 minutes in a public building, and it was done. The reporters had been following the romance for months, and they were there, or near enough, because a story like this could not be kept quiet. The marriage of Ellin Mackay and Irving Berlin ran on the front pages of the country. The heiress and the songwriter, the Catholic aristocrat and the Jewish immigrant, the flag on the roof of Harbour Hill, and the boy who had sung for coins on the Lower East Side, joined in 10 minutes at a city clerk's desk. The symbolism was so perfect that no novelist would have dared to invent it. A woman whose family had spent a fortune and 3 generations building a private world of château and armour and private ceremony chose the most public and least private setting in the city to be married, the civic office, where the state joins any 2 citizens who ask. A woman raised to believe she was categorically different from ordinary people, married exactly as ordinary people did, and married one of them, in their building, under their law. Every grand thing her wedding might have been, and was expected to be, she refused, and the refusal was the message. She was announcing, in the plainest civic terms available, that she rejected the whole apparatus of distinction her family lived by, that she would be married as a person and not as a dynasty, that the daughter of Harbour Hill had come down off the hill for good. Her father read the message exactly as it was meant, and it enraged him because there was no misunderstanding it. She had not eloped in secret shame. She had married in the open, in the people's building, on purpose, and let the whole country see her do it. It was the kind of story the new tabloid century had been invented to tell, and it was told everywhere. Every element of it was built for the front page. There was money, a great deal of it, thrown away in a single gesture. There was a beautiful young woman and a famous man. There was a stern father and a forbidden love and a defiance carried out in public. There was religion and class and the whole raw question of who belonged with whom in a changing country. A newspaper editor could not have invented a story better calculated to sell papers, and the papers sold. For weeks, the marriage was argued over at breakfast tables from New York to San Francisco, and everyone had an opinion, and the opinions divided along every fault line the country possessed. To some it was a scandal, a daughter's betrayal of her blood and her faith. To others it was a fairy tale, love triumphing over money and snobbery. To almost everyone it was irresistible, and it made Ellin Mackay and Irving Berlin, for a season, the most talked-about couple in America, watched and judged by millions of people who would never meet them, and whose own lives the marriage did not touch at all. Afterward, the couple went, of all the modest places in the world, to Atlantic City, the great boardwalk resort on the New Jersey shore, for a honeymoon as ordinary and American as the ceremony had been. There exists still a scrap of film from those days, the new husband and the new wife posing together in the winter light by the sea, a rich man of the theatre and the woman who had just given up a fortune to stand beside him, looking in the flickering images simply like two people who had gotten what they wanted. They had. What it had cost would arrive soon enough, but for a few days on a cold boardwalk it was only a marriage, and a happy one. The choice of Atlantic City is itself a small revelation. A woman who had grown up summering among the great estates, who could have honeymooned anywhere in the world on her husband's fortune, went to a popular American boardwalk resort, the kind of place ordinary families went, and by all appearances she was perfectly content there. This was the life she had chosen, and it fit her. She had not run off with Berlin in order to trade one kind of grandeur for another. She had run off to be an ordinary, happy woman, married to the man she loved, and an ordinary boardwalk in January suited that ambition exactly. The heiress of Harbour Hill, who had been raised to think of herself as a rung above almost everyone, spent the first days of her marriage as one of the crowd by the winter sea, and she looked, in the little that survives of those days, entirely at peace. Everything the old world would have counted as a come-down, she seems to have counted as freedom. Back in New York, the machinery of consequence was already turning. A father who had lit his roof for a prince had watched his daughter marry a Lower East Side songwriter in a 10-minute civil ceremony that the whole country read about over breakfast. He was a proud man, and he had been publicly defied by the one person he had sworn to keep in hand, in the full glare of the same press that had once described his triumphs. He would answer the only way a man like him knew how to answer, with the fortune, and the answer would be total, and it would last for years. The honeymoon by the sea was the last uncomplicated happiness of the story for a long time. When the couple came back, the door of Harbour Hill was already closing, and behind it stood a father counting out, in his head, the exact price he would make his daughter pay. Chapter 10. $9 million. Then silence. The price arrived quickly. Clarence Mackay barred his daughter from the family home, cut her out of his will, and stopped speaking to her, and the silence he built that winter would stand for years. The sum she forfeited has always been given as an estimate, because the inner arrangements of a fortune like the Mackays were never fully public. But the figure that has come down through every telling is roughly $9 million. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment in the money of the time. $9 million in the middle of the 1920s was a fortune that could have kept a woman in the first rank of American society for the whole of her life and her children after her. a sum with the weight of a small dynasty behind it. Ellin Mackay signed it away in the 10 minutes it took to marry Irving Berlin, and she did it with her eyes open. She had grown up in the Hall of Armour. She knew to the last decimal what she was giving up. She gave it up anyway. Her father's retaliation went beyond money, because money was only ever his instrument, and the true wound he meant to inflict was exile. She was barred from Harbour Hill, shut out of the great lit house that had been built, in part, to be hers. She was cut from her father's life, unspoken to, unacknowledged, as though the daughter he had shown to a prince had ceased to exist. For a proud man who had already been publicly abandoned once by his wife, this was the logic of the old wound repeating itself. He would not be defied and remain in the room with the one who defied him. He had lost control of his daughter, as he had once lost control of her mother, and he answered the loss the same way, by closing the door and refusing to open it. To grasp what the exile cost, remember what she was being shut out of. Harbour Hill was not merely a grand address. It was her childhood, her father, the Hall of Armour she had grown up among, the only home she had ever known, the whole physical world of the Mackay name. To be barred from it was to be cut not only from an inheritance, but from a past, told in effect that she no longer belonged to the family that had made her. Her father did this deliberately, and he did it completely. There was no partial estrangement, no cool but continued contact. There was a closed door and a silence, maintained by a man with the will to maintain anything, and the daughter on the other side of it had to build an entire life, knowing that the father who had once shown her to a prince now behaved as though she had died. She had chosen it, with open eyes, and choosing it did not make it painless. A person can be certain of a decision and still grieve what it costs, and Ellin surely did both in the years of the silence, even as her new life flourished. And the marriage did not stay private, because nothing about these two people ever could. The union of the Catholic silver heiress and the Jewish immigrant songwriter became one of the great public arguments of its moment, a national conversation about faith and class, and what it meant that the walls between America's peoples might be coming down. From synagogue pulpits and church pulpits, the marriage was discussed and disputed. The newspapers ran it for weeks. It was set beside the most popular stage comedy of the decade, a long-running Broadway hit about a Jewish man who marries an Irish Catholic woman against the will of both their fathers, until life seemed to be imitating the theatre in the most public household in New York. The romance that had begun as a society scandal had become something larger, a story the whole country used to argue with itself about who was allowed to marry whom, and the argument it opened would still be alive 100 years later. It helps to see why the marriage struck such a nerve across the whole country, because the answer reaches past this one couple into the anxieties of the age. America in the 1920s was a nation arguing with itself about immigration and assimilation, about who counted as truly American, and how far the old families would have to open their doors to the children of the newcomers crowding the cities. The Mackays, only 2 generations from an Irish immigrant with nothing, had climbed to the top and then pulled the ladder up behind them, marrying into the world of cathedrals and châteaux and lighting their roof for an English prince. Now, the daughter of that family proposed to marry a Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side, and in doing so, she seemed to embody the very thing the old order feared: the blurring of the lines, the marriage of the tenement to the mansion, the arrival of the outsider, not as a servant, but as a son-in-law. People who had never met either of them argued about the match, because the match was about them, about their country, about which America was going to win. The comedy on Broadway had made the same collision funny. The Mackay marriage made it real, and it made it front-page news, and the debate it started about who may marry whom, and what a family owes to its faith and its bloodline, and what it owes to its children's happiness, did not end when the papers moved on. It is an argument the country was still having 100 years later. Beneath the public noise, though, a quieter thing had happened, and it is the heart of the chapter. When Clarence Mackay cut off his daughter's inheritance, he intended to leave her exposed, a woman who had thrown away her security for a whim and would have to live with the consequence. But she was not exposed, because the man she had married had already seen to it, in the most personal way a songwriter could. Among the songs Berlin had written for her during the long separation was the ballad called Always, and always was not only a promise in words. Berlin gave Ellin the rights to the song, the royalties, the income it would earn for as long as people sang it, and people would sing it for the rest of the century. The father had taken away the fortune that was meant to bind his daughter to him. The husband had replaced it with a fortune of his own making, one that came with no strings and no conditions, only the words of a love song. The security her father used as a leash, Berlin handed back to her as a gift. There is a hard justice in this that the story never stops turning over. Clarence Mackay believed that money was control, that the $9 million was the chain by which a daughter could be kept in her place. Irving Berlin, who had come from nothing and built everything, understood money differently, as something a man made and then gave to the people he loved. In taking the inheritance away, the father revealed exactly what he had always thought his daughter was, an asset to be managed. In giving her the song, the husband revealed exactly what he thought she was, a person to be freed. The $9 million was gone, and it turned out not to matter nearly as much as her father had believed it would, and that, more than the wedding itself, was the thing he could not forgive. She had proven she could live without him, and so the two of them settled into a standoff that neither would end, because ending it meant being the one who yielded, and both of them had far too much of the same iron in them for that. Clarence would not call his daughter, because to call her was to accept the marriage he had sworn was intolerable. Ellin would not beg her father, because she had done nothing she believed was wrong, and would not pretend otherwise to be let back into the house. Each waited for the other. Each had the will to wait a very long time. It was, in a bleak way, a family resemblance. The same stubbornness in the father and the daughter, pointed at each other across a silence that neither would break with a word. A lesser will on either side would have cracked. Neither of these two had a lesser will. They could have gone to their graves in that silence, the proud father and the proud daughter, each certain of being right, and very nearly they did. The silence between them settled in for the long winter, and it might have lasted the rest of their lives had a far greater sorrow not come to break it. Chapter 11. The Song That Made Her Safe. The fortune was gone, and yet in the small rooms of her married life, Ellin Mackay had something Harbour Hill, for all its acres and armour, had never given her. She had a home that was actually hers, and a marriage that worked. The life she had chosen was, by the standards she had been raised in, modest, and by any human standard, rich beyond counting. Irving Berlin was one of the wealthiest men in American entertainment, but his was a wealth of a wholly different texture from her father's, made and not inherited, tied to the living work of songs rather than to silver in the ground or cables under the sea. He kept writing, and the songs kept coming, and the money kept arriving, clean and current and entirely his own. In the year of their marriage, he wrote Blue Skies, a song of pure, uncomplicated happiness, and it became one of the great hits of the decade, and it is not hard to hear in it the mood of a man who had just won the thing he wanted most. The household they built together ran on that kind of money, the money of a man at the height of his powers doing exactly what he was born to do. There was a quality to Berlin's wealth that suited the life they were building, and it is worth seeing clearly because it is the deep contrast the whole story runs on. Her father's money had been dug out of a mountain and laid under an ocean by other men, generations back, and it sat in the family like an inheritance of stone, enormous and inert, and, as it turned out, terribly vulnerable to a single bad autumn on the stock exchange. Berlin's money was alive. It came in every day, from every corner of the country, wherever a band struck up one of his tunes, or a family gathered around a piano with his sheet music open on the stand. It was tied to nothing but his own gift and the public's love of it, and both of those were inexhaustible. A household run on that kind of income had a lightness the great fortunes lacked. It did not have to be guarded like a hoard. It simply arrived, renewed itself, and arrived again, the natural product of a man doing the work he was made for. Ellin had left a fortune that felt like a fortress and married one that felt like weather, and in the years to come, the difference between the two would decide everything. And there was a freedom in the lighter kind of wealth that the heavier kind had never allowed her. Her father's money had come with her father attached to it, with his expectations and his conditions and his power to give or withhold. Berlin's money came with nothing but Berlin, who wanted only to make her happy and had already handed her a fortune of her own in the rights to a song. For the first time in her life, Ellin was not living on money that someone could use to control her. She was living in a household where the wealth was clean, current, and freely given, and where she was a partner rather than an asset. It changed the very texture of her days. She had traded the gilded cage for a smaller and far warmer house, and she never, by any account, looked back at the cage with regret. The life inside that warmer house was, by every sign, a working artist's life and a happy one. A man who wrote an estimated 1,500 songs did not set the work aside when he married, and Berlin went on composing through the years of their early marriage, filling their home with the sound of a piano and the constant private labour of making the melodies the country would sing. Ellin wrote at her own desk, while her husband worked at his keyboard, two makers under one roof, each occupied with the thing they were born to do, the daughter growing up between them. It was a household organised around work and love rather than around display, the opposite in every way of the great silent house on the hill where she had grown up among servants and armour. She had left a place built to be looked at and made herself a place built to be lived in. And the difference, to a woman who had spent her childhood as an exhibit, must have felt like air after a long time held underwater. Into that household, in the November after the wedding, in 1926, came their first child, a daughter, Mary Ellin. She was born to a mother who had walked away from a silver fortune and a father who had walked out of a Lower East Side tenement, and she would grow up to be a writer like her mother, and, in time, to write the book that told this family's story from the inside. Her arrival made the young marriage a family, and it did so while the great door of Harbour Hill was still closed, and the father across the water of the East River still would not speak. Ellin had traded one family for another, the old one that had cast her out for the new one she was building with her own hands, and for a while, the trade looked like nothing but a triumph. This is the part of the story that the headlines never captured, because contentment does not sell papers. The public knew the scandal, the disinheritance, the silence, the great romance defying the great fortune. What the public did not see was the ordinary happiness underneath it, a clever woman and a brilliant man who genuinely delighted in each other, building a life in which she was, for the first time, no one's asset and no one's treaty, simply herself. Married to a man who adored her, and who had made certain she would never depend on anyone's permission again. She wrote, he composed, the daughter grew. The money came from songs. It was, by every account that survives, a marriage of real and lasting love, and it had begun in defiance so complete that the whole country had watched it happen. It is one of the small injustices of history that this ordinary happiness left so faint a record next to the loud scandal that produced it. The newspapers had covered every turn of the forbidden romance, the disinheritance, the defiance, and then, once the couple were safely and undramatically content, the newspapers lost interest because contentment is not news. So the public memory kept the scandal and forgot the marriage, kept the $9 million thrown away and forgot the 60 years of devotion that followed, kept the drama of the wedding and forgot the long, quiet decades that proved the wedding right. Yet those decades were the real answer to everyone who had predicted disaster. Day after unremarkable day, the songwriter and the heiress simply loved each other and raised their children and did their work, and the ordinariness of it was itself the vindication. Their eldest daughter, Mary Ellin, growing up inside that household, would carry its private truth into the next century, when she wrote a memoir of her father and let the world see, at last, the tenderness that the scandal sheets had never bothered to record. The marriage the whole country had watched begin in defiance turned out to be, in its daily substance, one of the most stable and affectionate unions imaginable, and almost no one outside the family ever knew it. And yet the silence with her father sat in the middle of all this happiness like a stone, because a wound like theirs is not healed by the happiness of the one who caused it. Ellin had her marriage and her daughter, and her song and her safety, and she did not have her father, and some part of her surely felt the lack of him even as she flourished without him. She was a daughter who had been shown to a prince and then shut out of the house, and no amount of new joy entirely fills a space shaped like that. The estrangement was the price she went on paying quietly, month after month, while the papers wrote about her triumph. For a while, it might have held that way indefinitely, a happy marriage on one side of a permanent silence, a proud father on the other, each waiting for the other to break first, and neither breaking. Clarence Mackay was not a man to yield, and his daughter had inherited his will, along with his stubbornness, and the two of them could have gone on in their separate silences for the whole of their lives. It would have taken something enormous to move a man that proud, something that reached past the pride and the money and the public defiance to the simple fact that this was his child. As it happened, something enormous was coming. It was coming in the winter of 1928, and it would arrive on the one morning of the year most freighted with meaning, and it would break the silence at the highest imaginable cost. Chapter 12. A crib on Christmas morning. On Christmas morning, 1928, the thing that finally broke the silence between father and daughter was the worst thing that could happen to any of them. It was the death of a child. Their second baby, a son, had been born on the 1st of December, 1928. They named him Irving Berlin, after his father, the boy who would carry the songwriter's name into the next generation. For 3 weeks, the small household on the far side of the family quarrel had everything it could have wanted: a thriving marriage, a growing daughter, and now a son. And then, on Christmas morning, the child was found dead in his crib, 3 weeks old, gone in the night for reasons that in that era had no name and no explanation. He had been alive at the turn of the month, and by Christmas he was gone. And the holiday that the whole country spent in celebration became, in that house, the day their son had died. The record is right to pass over the details with restraint, and so should any telling of it, because there is nothing to add to the plain fact of it that does not diminish it. A 3-week-old child died in his sleep on Christmas morning. His parents, who had defied a fortune and a father and a nation's opinion to be together, could do nothing but bury him. Whatever grief is, in its deepest and most private form, it was in that house that winter, and it belonged to them alone. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to reach for consolation too quickly, to hurry past the grave toward the reconciliation it produced, as though the good that came of the loss could somehow balance the loss itself. It cannot. And the honest thing is to sit for a moment in the plain fact before moving on. 2 people who had already sacrificed a great deal to build a life together lost their infant son in the night. Whatever they had endured before, the disinheritance, the exile, the years of public argument, none of it had prepared them for this, because nothing prepares anyone for this. Berlin, who had buried a young wife 16 years earlier, now buried a son, and he did it on the morning the rest of the world reserved for joy. Ellin, who had proven she could give up a fortune and stand alone against her father and her whole society, could do nothing at all against this. There was no defiance available, no clever essay, no act of will that could change it. For once, the strong-willed woman at the center of this story was simply a mother who had lost her child, and there is nothing to say about that except that it happened, and that it was the worst thing that ever happened to her. But grief, sometimes, reaches places that pride has sealed off, and it reached Clarence Mackay. Word of the death crossed the silence that had stood for nearly 3 years, and the father who would not speak to his daughter over a marriage found that he could not stay silent over the death of her child, his grandchild, a boy who had carried into the world the blood of the Mackays, whether Clarence had willed it or not. The estrangement that money and pride and public defiance had built, and that might have lasted a lifetime, did not survive the loss of the baby. The father came back. Over the grave of a 3-week-old child, the door of Harbour Hill that had been closed against Ellin since her wedding finally opened, and the family that the marriage had broken began, in the worst way imaginable, to be a family again. What broke in Clarence Mackay that winter was the thing that had held longest, the pride that had governed him since his own wife walked out. For nearly 3 years, he had treated his daughter as though she had ceased to exist, and he had done it out of a conviction that yielding would make him, once again, the man who could be defied and abandoned without consequence. The death of the baby cut underneath all of that. It reached the part of him that was simply a father, that had raised 3 children alone in the great house, that had loved the difficult, brilliant daughter even while he refused to speak to her. Confronted with her grief, and with the loss of a grandson who had carried the Mackay blood into the world, whatever Clarence had willed, the pride that had survived the wedding and the disinheritance and the years of public argument finally gave way. He came back, and once he had come back, he stayed. The reconciliation was not a truce that might break again. It held for the rest of his life, through everything that followed, and when his own ruin came, he would accept the help of the very son-in-law he had once forbidden. The door, once opened, did not close again. It had simply taken the worst grief of their lives to open it. There is no comfort in this, and the story should not pretend there is. The reconciliation Ellin had surely longed for came, but it came at a price that made it almost unbearable, the price of her son. She got her father back, and she got him back because her child had died. The 2 facts are bound together and cannot be separated, and they sit at the exact center of the whole story, the place where all its ironies gather. The $9 million had not moved him. The years of silence had not moved him. The happiness of her marriage had not moved him. It took the death of a baby to move him, and no one, looking at it honestly, could call that a happy ending. though it was, in its terrible way, a reunion. The cruelty of the timing is almost more than the story can carry, and it is worth naming plainly rather than hurrying past. The reconciliation Ellin must have wanted through all the years of silence, the return of her father, the healing of the family, came to her wrapped inside the death of her son. She could not have one without the other. The father came back because the baby died, and no arrangement of the facts can separate the gift from the grief, because they were the same event. This is the knot at the center of the whole story, the place where all its ironies gather and refuse to come apart. Money had not moved Clarence Mackay. Time had not moved him. His daughter's happiness had not moved him. Only the death of a grandchild moved him. And so the thing Ellin had longed for arrived by the one road she would never have chosen. She got her father back, and the price was her son, and she had to live the rest of her life holding both of those truths at once, the reunion and the loss, bound together forever, inseparable, the best and the worst thing wearing the same face. And there is one more thing the story must hold here, quietly, because it belongs to the man who lost the child, and it echoes for the rest of the century. Irving Berlin, who had already buried one young wife and now buried an infant son on Christmas Day, would go on, years later, to write the most beloved Christmas song in the history of the world, a song of longing and homesickness, and a whiteness that never quite comes, sung every December by millions of people who have no idea that the man who wrote it spent every Christmas of his long life visiting the grave of the son he lost on Christmas morning in 1928. The happiest Christmas music the country would ever have came out of the saddest Christmas a family ever spent. That knot would take years to tie, and it waits for the end of this story. For now, there was only a small grave, and a father and daughter standing on the same side of it at last, and the fortune that had divided them already beginning, though none of them yet knew it, to disappear. Chapter 13. The Crash That Took the Father. The disinheritance was supposed to be Ellin's punishment. Instead, the punishment fell, with a completeness no novelist would dare invent, on the man who had ordered it. The turn began quietly, in the way the largest disasters often do, with what looked at the time like a shrewd piece of business. In the last years of the 1920s, Clarence Mackay sold his greatest asset, the postal telegraph company that his father had built, and he had run for a lifetime, into the great new combine called the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, taking his payment in stock. On paper, it made him richer than ever. A founder of one of the coming giants of the modern economy, his fortune converted from wires and cables into shares that seemed only to climb. For a man at the summit of the age, it was the natural next move. The old empire of the telegraph folded into the new empire of the corporation, and Clarence Mackay went into the autumn of 1929 as wealthy, on paper, as he had ever been. Then came the crash. In the autumn of 1929, the American stock market collapsed, and it took Clarence Mackay's paper fortune down with it. The shares he had taken in exchange for his life's work turned to almost nothing. The man who owned the cables under the ocean, who had lit his roof for a prince and hung a Queen's Raphael on his wall, was, in the space of a few weeks, effectively ruined. The great machine of Mackay wealth, which had seemed as permanent as the stone the house was built from, proved to be exactly as fragile as every other fortune exposed to that October, and it came apart in his hands. The speed of it is what still stuns. A fortune 3 generations in the making, silver dug from a Nevada mountain in the 1870s, cables laid under the Atlantic, an empire of wire that carried the messages of a continent, the whole vast Mackay accumulation, had seemed as fixed a feature of the American landscape as the mountains the silver came from. And in a matter of weeks, in the autumn of 1929, it was effectively undone. This is the thing about the great fortunes of that era that their owners could never quite believe until it happened to them. However solid the money looked, however many houses and paintings and suits of armor it had been turned into, at bottom, a great deal of it was paper, promises, and shares, and valuations that depended on everyone agreeing to go on believing in them. When the belief collapsed, the paper collapsed, and no amount of stone on a Long Island hill could hold up a fortune whose foundation had turned to air. Clarence Mackay had converted his life's work into exactly that kind of paper, at exactly the wrong moment, and the market that had made him look richer than ever in the summer made him a ruined man by the winter. What followed was a slow and public dismantling of everything the lit roof had stood for. Harbour Hill, which cost a fortune merely to keep running, with its 126 servants and its acres of grounds, could not be sustained by a ruined man, and it was closed by the early 1930s. The great collection that had been assembled to prove the family's permanence was sold off to pay for the family's survival. The old masters, the Botticelli, and the Raphael and the rest went out through the famous dealers of the day, sold in a falling market at a heavy loss. The incomparable collection of Renaissance armor, the hall of steel knights, among which Ellin had grown up believing her family would last forever, was broken up, some of it going to the Metropolitan Museum, where a visitor can still stand before it today with no idea that it once stood guard over the childhood of a girl who gave up $9 million for a songwriter. Piece by piece, the proof of permanence was carried out of the house and sold. There is a particular poignancy in where the armor ended up. The Hall of Steel Knights had been the heart of the illusion, the clearest statement Harbour Hill ever made that the Mackays belonged among the noble houses of the old world and would endure as they had. Now the knights were crated up and carried out and sold to a museum, where they would stand forever behind glass, admired by strangers, labelled and catalogued, the private glory of one family turned into a public exhibit. Everything the collection had been meant to say about permanence was refuted by the simple fact of its sale. The armour had outlasted the men who wore it by 4 centuries, and it had outlasted the fortune that bought it by only 30 years. A child had grown up believing those knights guarded a family that could not fall, and before that child was old, the knights had been sold to pay the family's debts, and the house they guarded was headed for the dynamite. If there is a single image for the hollowness of the thing Clarence Mackay had built, it is the armour going out the door in crates while the man who had assembled it sold his paintings to survive. And here, the story delivers its cruelest and most perfect reversal. The daughter, Clarence Mackay, had disinherited for marrying beneath the family, was by the early 1930s the member of that family standing on the most solid ground. Her household did not depend on the stock market. It depended on Irving Berlin, on the endless renewable wealth of songs that millions of people wanted to hear, a fortune that the crash could not touch because it was made fresh every year out of the work of a living man. And so the immigrant songwriter, whom Clarence Mackay had judged unworthy of his daughter, became, in the ruin that followed, one of the quiet supports of the very family that had cast him out. Berlin, who asked for no credit and sought no revenge, helped hold up his father-in-law in the man's reduced years. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is almost too neat to believe. The immigrant songwriter, the man from the Lower East Side, whom Clarence Mackay had judged unfit to marry his daughter, unfit to enter his house, unfit to bear any relation to the Mackay name, became one of the hands that kept the ruined Mackay standing. The despised outsider turned out to be the family's safety net. And he did it without gloating, without extracting an apology, without ever once, as far as the record shows, reminding the old man of what he had said and done. He simply helped, because Ellin loved her father, and because that was the kind of man Berlin was. There is no revenge in the whole story to match it, precisely because it was not revenge. It was the quiet, complete refutation of everything Clarence Mackay had believed about the man, delivered not in words, but in the plainest possible deed, the disowned son-in-law paying to support the father who had disowned him. Whatever satisfaction Ellin took from her choice, this must have been the deepest of it, to watch the man her father called a nobody become the one her father had to lean on. The fortune Ellin had walked away from had vanished into the crash. The fortune her father had despised was the one still standing. And in that reversal, there is a vindication of her instinct so complete that it almost frightens. When she was 22 years old, she had chosen, without any way of knowing what was coming, a fortune tied to a living man's gift over a fortune tied to markets and mines and paper. She could not have predicted the crash. She could not have known that within 4 years the great Mackay wealth would evaporate, while the songwriter's income rolled on untouched. She simply chose the man, for love, and it turned out that in choosing the man she had also, blindly, chosen the sounder fortune, the one that could not be wiped out in a single autumn because it renewed itself every day out of the work of a living artist. The bet she made with her heart turned out to be the shrewdest financial decision anyone in her family made that decade, and she had made it for reasons that had nothing to do with money at all. Everything Clarence Mackay had believed about money and worth had been turned exactly upside down, and he lived to see it. Chapter 14. An emerald, as everything vanished. Even as the money drained away, Clarence Mackay reached, one last time, for the grand gesture that had defined his whole life. He bought his second wife one of the largest emeralds in America. By the early 1930s, his first wife, Catherine Dewar, was gone. She had died in 1930, after an attempt late in her life to reconcile with the husband she had left 2 decades before. An attempt that came to nothing before she died. With her death, the old vow that had kept Clarence from remarrying, the vow of a devout Catholic not to take a second wife while the first still lived, was released, and in 1931, he married again. His choice was Anna Case, a celebrated soprano of the Metropolitan Opera, a woman of the stage. And as a wedding gift, in the middle of his ruin, he gave her a necklace built by Cartier around a single Colombian emerald of some 168 carats, a stone so extraordinary that it carries the family name to this day and now sits in a national museum given to the nation long after both of them were gone. There is a quiet echo in that final destination of what happened to the armor. The great emerald, the last extravagant flourish of Mackay grandeur, ended exactly where the Hall of Steel Knights ended, behind glass in a public museum, admired by strangers who file past with no notion of the family it once belonged to. The armor went to one museum, the emerald to another, the paintings to walls all over the world. Piece by piece, the treasures that had been gathered to prove the permanence of a single family were scattered into the keeping of the public, which is another way of saying that they came to belong to no one in particular. The permanence had been an illusion all along. The objects survived. The family that owned them did not. And today, a visitor can stand before the emerald or the armor and never once think of Clarence Mackay, or of the daughter who grew up among those knights and gave up a fortune to escape the world they guarded. The death of Catherine Dewar, that year before the second marriage, deserves a moment of its own, because it closes the wound the whole story opened on. The mother, who had walked out of Harbour Hill and left her children behind, who had married her surgeon in Paris and lived her own complicated life across the decades, came back at the very end, seeking a reconciliation with the husband she had left almost 20 years before. It did not come in time. She died in 1930, the attempt unfinished. And whatever might have been repaired between them was left forever unrepaired. There is a terrible rhyme in it. The father, who could not forgive his daughter until a death forced his hand, had himself been left by a wife who tried, too late, to come back. The same pride, the same closed door, the same reconciliation reaching for a hand that grief or death had already moved out of reach. The family kept making the same shape of tragedy in every generation, the proud refusal, the late and costly return, and Catherine's lonely death was one more turn of it. There is something almost unbearably revealing in that emerald. Here was a man effectively broken by the crash, selling his paintings and his armor to survive, closing the greatest house on Long Island, and still, at the center of the wreckage, performing the old gesture of limitless Mackay grandeur, the enormous jewel, the Cartier setting, the flourish worthy of a silver king. The pride that had lit the roof for a prince and disinherited a daughter did not bend even when the fortune that fed it was gone. He would be Clarence Mackay of Harbour Hill to the end, whatever the ledgers said, and if the money to be that man no longer existed, he would be him anyway, on credit, on memory, on the sheer refusal to be anything less. There is, too, a strange symmetry in the woman he chose the second time. Anna Case was a singer, a soprano who made her name and her living performing for the public on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. She belonged, in other words, to exactly the professional world Clarence Mackay had condemned in Irving Berlin, the world of the theatre and the footlights and the paid performance, the world a proper family did not marry into. The man who had disinherited his daughter for marrying a man of the stage spent his own last years married to a woman of the stage. Whether he ever saw the irony is not recorded, but it is there, plain in the facts. One more sign that the world he had defended with the flag on the roof was already gone, even from his own house. The emerald he hung around Anna Case's neck was a relic of a vanished order, the last flourish of a grandeur that no longer had anything behind it. And the marriage itself quietly conceded the very thing he had ruined his relationship with his daughter to deny, that the stage was no disgrace, and a person's worth was not fixed by the world they came from. The end came for him in 1938. Clarence Mackay died of cancer on the 12th of November that year, reconciled with the daughter he had once cast out, supported in his last years, in part by the son-in-law he had once forbidden, his great fortune spent, his great collection dispersed. He was buried with every honor his diminished world could still summon. His funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and the New York Philharmonic, the orchestra he had loved and patronized in his years of power, played for him. The man who had owned the cables under the ocean went to his grave to the sound of the music he had paid to keep alive, in the great cathedral of his faith, mourned as a prince of the old order even as the order itself was passing. He died reconciled, which is the one mercy in his ending. The daughter he had cast out was his daughter again, had been for a decade, and the grandchildren he had refused to acknowledge were part of his life. Whatever the pride had cost all of them in the lost years, it had been set down before the end, over the grave of a baby and across the ruin of a fortune. And Clarence Mackay did not die as the man who had shut his daughter out. He died as her father, restored to her, supported in part by the son-in-law he had once forbidden, mourned by the family the marriage had nearly destroyed, and then, in the strangest way, remade. The order he had belonged to was passing, and much of his fortune had already passed. But the human thing, the tie between a father and a daughter, had been saved from the wreck. It was the only part of the empire that survived him, and the house did not long outlive him. Harbour Hill, closed and emptied, stood for a few more years as a vast abandoned monument to a vanished fortune, and then, in 1947, it was destroyed, brought down with dynamite. The largest house Stanford White ever built reduced to rubble on the highest ground in Roslyn. The 648 acres were carved up and sold, and within a few years, some 400 ordinary suburban houses stood where the chateau had been, where the tunnel of blue lights had run for a mile, where the flag had blazed on the roof for the Prince of Wales. The lit house, the great proof of Mackay permanence, was gone so completely that a family driving today through the pleasant streets that cover its ground would have no way of knowing it had ever existed. The armour went to the museum, the paintings went to other walls, the emerald went to the nation, and the daughter who had been told she was throwing her life away outlived the house, the fortune, the collection, and the father. And she outlived them as something he had never quite let her be, a writer at her own desk. Chapter 15. The writer alone at her desk. While the world she was born into came down around her, Ellin Mackay quietly became the one thing she had always wanted to be. She became a writer, in full, on her own terms, and she stayed one for the rest of her long life. The girl who had shaken a nation with a single essay did not stop when the scandal faded. In the years after her marriage, she kept writing, publishing short stories in the great popular magazines of the day through the 1930s, and then she turned to books. She wrote novels, 4 of them across the decades, drawing on the world she had come from and the one she had chosen. In 1944, she published Land I Have Chosen, and later came Lace Curtain and, near the end, The Best of Families. But the most telling of them appeared in 1957 and was called Silver Platter, and in it she told the story of her own family, the immigrant rise out of the Comstock silver, the making of the fortune she had walked away from, set down at last in the hand of the daughter who had given it up. The heiress who had been raised to be written about had insisted, across a whole lifetime, on being the one who did the writing. And in Silver Platter she took the very family that had tried to trade her and made it, instead, her material. There is something quietly triumphant in that career, and it is easy to overlook for anyone watching only for scandal. The world Ellin was born into had a single use for a daughter: to be placed, to marry, to become the ornament of a great house and the mother of its heirs. Writing was, at best, an amusement for such a woman, a thing to be set aside once real life, meaning marriage, began. Ellin never set it aside. She had shaken the country with an essay before she married, and she went on, decade after decade, publishing stories and then novels, doing the slow, unglamorous work of the writer long after the scandal that made her famous had faded from memory. She was not a society woman who dabbled. She was a working author with a body of work, and she built it in the years when the fortune she had refused was collapsing, and the house she had grown up in was being torn down. While the monuments of the Mackay name came down one by one, she was quietly assembling the one kind of monument her family had never valued, a shelf of books with her name on the spine, made of nothing but her own mind and her own labour, owing nothing to the silver or the cables or the great lost house. And there is a fine irony in the name on those spines. She published as Irving Berlin, carrying into the world of letters the very name her father had judged unworthy of her, the immigrant songwriter's name, and it was under that name that she made her own mark and earned her own place. The Mackay name, the silver name, the name that had lit its roof for a prince, she had traded away, and it faded with the fortune. The name she kept and made her own was the one her father had forbidden. When people remember Ellin at all today, they remember her as Berlin, the writer, the wife, the woman who gave up a fortune. And every one of those identities carries the name of the man her whole world told her not to marry. She had taken the name they said would diminish her, and she had made it, in her own quiet way, a name worth remembering. Her life filled out around the writing in the ordinary, sustaining ways. She and Berlin had 2 more daughters after the loss of their son, Linda Louise, in 1932, and Elizabeth in 1936, so that the household that had known the worst kind of grief became, in time, a full and lively family of daughters. She served her country in small official ways, sitting on a federal commission, and she gave herself to relief work during the years of the Second World War. She had grown up the appraised jewel of the marriage market, and she had become a working writer and the mother of a family and a woman with a public life entirely her own. None of it granted by a father, none of it dependent on a fortune, all of it built by her own choosing. She had come by her seriousness honestly, and she gave it to her country as well as to her desk. She served on a federal commission, taking a small formal share in the public life of the nation, and in the years of the Second World War, she turned her energy to relief work, doing the unglamorous labor of a woman who believed she owed something beyond her own comfort. She had grown up with every reason to become idle, an heiress with a fortune waiting for her, and nothing required of her but a good marriage. She had walked away from the fortune, and she spent the life she chose instead in steady, productive work at the writing desk and in the causes she took up, a woman fully occupied with things that mattered to her. The girl who had been raised as an ornament made herself, across 60 years, into something no one in her father's world had expected or wanted her to be, a useful and accomplished woman with a life of her own making. And through all of it, decade after decade, the marriage simply held. This is the quiet miracle at the end of the loud story, and it deserves to be said plainly, because so many predicted the opposite. The whole of respectable society had watched the heiress marry the songwriter and had waited, many of them, for the inevitable ruin, the regret, the collapse of a union built across so many forbidden lines. It never came. Ellin and Irving Berlin stayed married for 62 years, through the loss of a child, the ruin of her father, the reconciliation, the death of her parents, the coming and going of fashions and wars and whole eras of American life. The marriage that had cost her $9 million and her father's love turned out to be the most durable thing in the entire story. More durable than the house, than the fortune, than the collection, than any of the permanent things the armor in the hall had been meant to promise. And the daughters grew up and had lives of their own, and the family that had begun in defiance and passed through the worst of griefs became, in the fullness of time, simply a family with its holidays and its houses and its long, ordinary happiness. Ellin and Irving grew old together. The frantic young songwriter who had courted her across an ocean by radio became an elder statesman of American music, and the heiress who had scandalized society became a respected novelist and the calm center of a large and devoted household. The decades that would have been unimaginable to the crowds arguing about their marriage in 1926 simply accumulated, one after another, quiet and full. Whatever the world had predicted for the immigrant songwriter and the runaway heiress, the reality was the least sensational thing possible. They were happy for a very long time, and they stayed that way. She had made a bet on a cold morning in 1926 that the man was worth more than the money. It was the kind of bet the whole weight of her world had been arranged to prevent her from making, and she had made it anyway. And she spent the next 6 decades quietly being proven right. The fortune was gone. The marriage remained. And the man she had chosen, the immigrant her father had called a nobody, kept one private appointment, year after year, that told the truth of the whole thing better than any of her novels ever could. Chapter 16. Every Christmas, one small grave. For 60 years, on the one morning of the year the whole country spent singing his most famous song, Irving Berlin went to visit his son. That is where this story ends, and it is where its meaning finally gathers. In 1942, 14 years after the crib on Christmas morning, Irving Berlin wrote a song called White Christmas. It was a song of longing, of a man far from home dreaming of a whiteness and a warmth that never quite arrive, and it became the best-selling single the world had ever known, sung and resung by millions upon millions of people. The sound of Christmas itself for generations who never thought to ask where it came from. It came from grief. The most beloved Christmas song in the history of the world was written by a man for whom Christmas was the anniversary of the worst morning of his life. And every year, while the country sang his song, he drove to a cemetery and stood at the grave of the 3-week-old son he had lost on Christmas Day in 1928. He did it for the rest of his life. The joy the whole world took from him each December was built on a sorrow he carried alone, and he never once let the world see the seam. Think of how far that sorrow travelled, hidden inside a song the whole world took for joy. Millions of families have sung White Christmas around their own tables, at their own gatherings, in their own moments of warmth. And almost none of them have known that the longing in it was real, that the man who wrote it was reaching, every year, toward a warmth that a Christmas morning had taken from him and never given back. He never told them. He let the country have the joy and kept the grief for himself, drove alone or with his wife to a cemetery on the one morning of universal celebration, and stood at the grave of a 3-week-old boy while his own melody played in 100 million rooms he would never enter. That is a kind of discipline most people never have to imagine. To give the world a gift made from your worst wound and never once let the world see the cost. He carried it for 60 years and set it down only when he died. And if you have ever wondered whether a person can be certain of a single choice across a whole long life, here is the answer, kept quietly every December at a small stone. Ellin Mackay never wavered either. She had chosen this man on a cold morning in a public building, against her father, against her fortune, against the settled opinion of her entire world, and she spent the next 62 years being proven right until her death in 1988, at the age of 85. Berlin, who had already outlived so much, could not outlive her by long. He died the following year, in 1989, at the age of 101, in his townhouse on Beekman Place. And Broadway darkened its lights for him, and the boy who had once sung for coins on the Lower East Side was mourned as one of the makers of the American century. In time, his daughters gave his life's work, some 750,000 pieces of it, the songs and the papers and the record of everything he had made, to the Library of Congress, so that the nation kept the archive of the man the Mackays had called a nobody. The immigrant who arrived through Ellis Island with nothing left the country its songs and left the National Library his papers, and the fortune that had once looked down on him is remembered now, when it is remembered at all, chiefly because his wife came out of it. History kept the songwriter and quietly forgot the silver. That was the final score of the quarrel, settled long after everyone who started it was gone. Think of everything the story swept away. The house was gone, dynamited on its hill. The fortune was gone, lost in a single autumn. The armor was gone, sold off to a museum. The paintings were gone, scattered to other walls. The great lit roof was gone, and the flag that blazed on it for a prince, and the tunnel of blue light along the mile of drive. all of it gone so completely that the ground it stood on is ordinary streets today. The silver was gone, and the cables under the ocean, and the proud father who had owned them, and the mother who had left, and the whole gilded world that had told a young woman exactly who she was permitted to love. All of it gone, and two things remained. The songs remained, and the marriage remained. And both of them had come from the man her father called a nobody. That was the word her father's world had used for Irving Berlin, a nobody, an immigrant songwriter, a person from the wrong faith and the wrong street and the wrong side of everything the flag on the roof had been lit to defend. The composer Jerome Kern, who understood music better than Clarence Mackay ever understood his daughter, had answered that word once and for all. Irving Berlin, he said, has no place in American music. He is American music. The Nobody was the country's own song. The heiress had heard it when her whole world could not, and she had staked $9 million and her father's love on being right about him, and she had won the bet so completely that 100 years later it is his music. The world still sings, and her essay that scholars still read, while the house and the fortune and the great name survive only as the answer to a question almost no one thinks to ask. Ellin Mackay gave up a fortune for a man her father forbade, and the fortune vanished and the man became immortal, and the deepest truth of her whole life is the plainest one. The thing they tried to sell her, the money, the house, the name, could not save any of the people who owned it. The thing they forbade her turned out to be the only thing that lasted. She had learned as a small girl, watching her mother go, that the walls of the great house did not hold. She spent the rest of her life proving that something else did. Not the silver, not the cables, not the armor in the hall, only the choice she made on a winter morning, and the man she made it for, and the song he left at a small grave every Christmas, faithful to the end. If a life can have a thesis, hers was that one. What would you have done, standing on those steps, with everything you had been raised to want on one side and everything you actually loved on the other? If this story moved you, subscribe, and stay with me for the other women the Gilded Age tried to keep in their place. And tell me honestly, down in the comments, if you had been Ellin Mackay, with $9 million on one side and him on the other, do you truly believe you would have signed it all away? I would love to know.